Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Checking my levels. Yes, we're good. Welcome to Dice Jailers. I am Jordan,
I'm Bjorn.
and this week we are going to talk about dungeons.
Yes,
We're talking about the first D in D&D.
we're
Uh,
finally gonna get that D.
that's we couldn't avoid it, but here we are.
That's what that means, right? That's what the kids are talking about. The
That's
Dungeons and
yeah,
Dragons.
yes, they are talking about Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, talking about dungeons. That's the D they mean.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause
Mm-hmm.
you don't get the dragons get you. That's when the D gets you. That's the dragons. If you get the D, it's dungeons.
So as you can see, we're already great for this episode. Before we get actually
Yeah.
into talking about things, uh, Bjorn, how
Yes.
you been, bud?
Pretty good. Yesterday was fun. I not that I was familiar with a whole lot of the players. I watched a lot of the draft for the Seattle Kraken because
Mm-hmm.
we have a hockey team now.
Yeah, we do. I don't know
Awesome.
shit about hockey, but I'm here for it.
Yeah, I'm gonna learn. I'm gonna learn. I'm really excited about it. So that was a lot of fun. Loved some of the Seattle legends or royalty, if you will, that announced some of the picks, like Gary Payton and Sean Kemp coming out
Mm-hmm.
there was pretty sweet. So that was cool. My building is not currently getting sold, so that's great. We're still in that
Yes.
not being sold. We'll see if the possibility of forming a co-op here or an LLC to purchase it ourselves as a bunch of tenants works, but
Mm-hmm.
that's that's a problem for tomorrow me.
Yep.
Our campaign is almost done.
Yeah,
Like
that's
that,
wild.
that's bittersweet. Where I'm like, oh man, we have like 4 sessions left, so it's been fun to write a lot of that. Um, it's fun to listen to you guys talk about your like last minute theories, like oh we're gonna run into this, oh we're gonna see this.
Right.
So I'm enjoying that. Um, I'm at
But
the
you
point
know
where
what I couldn't predict?
what's that?
Getting swallowed by a worm.
Well, you couldn't make it this coming week, and you asked me to take you out of the game somehow, and I
Yep.
went. I mean, what's hilarious? I know a
An
character gets
Alaskan bullworm.
character gets swallowed by a giant creature, and the rest of the party has to go chase it down. It's a great way to do an episode. Just play yakety sax. Good to go.
Uh, Someday I'll find something that sounds like Yakety Sax but isn't Yakety Sax so we can use it on the show.
Yeah, that's a song that I wish was public domain. I really do.
It should be.
It should. Plus, it has so many uses in life.
Absolutely.
I think almost any film clip is improved by adding yakety sax to the soundtrack.
I agree.
Like, just throw it in there, see what happens. It's
Yep, just Yakety Sax, let's do it.
much like yeah, we're like when we're talking about the D, just throw it in there.
Yep. No! No! Henry Crabgrass would be angry.
I no Henry Crabgrass would understand because you don't do it if you don't get consent. Like that's
Absolutely.
essential. It's essential.
Henry
How about you?
Crabgrass, for those of
How are
you
you
that
doing
don't
before I make
watch Critical Role,
how are you doing before I make more puns?
I'm I'm doing great. But
You don't
just
feel punished?
a moment, I'd feel punished by you.
Nah.
But uh, half second. Henry Crabgrass, for those of you that don't watch Critical Role, it was this Speak with Plants was cast,
Yep.
and there was just a little bit of Crabgrass that was Henry Crabgrass that was
Henry Crabgrass. Yes.
absolutely adorable and beloved by the fans and the cast immediately. And Henry Crabgrass is famously known for being very, very adamant about consent, even
Yep.
when petting grass.
Yes. Henry Crabgrass, the no grab ass crabgrass.
That's yeah, that fits. But anyway, I'm doing great. It's been a weird couple of days just getting stuff done.
Sure.
Uh, but today I got to go and I just big shout out because I forget how much my life is supplemented by any time I go into a place of business and there are black people working there. Because like I'm getting a suit to officiate a wedding next weekend, and went to go went to go like get my measurements done and whatnot, and they had to order the pants and a vest, and then we had to wait for them to come in, and just off of my measurements, they were able to pre-tailor the pants a bit.
Oh, nice.
So when I went in and like, because they had them in, I went in, put them on. They fit like a glove, except for like hemming the length of the pants, but they fit like a glove with just all of their pre-tailoring like work that they did, and they didn't have like any measurements or marks to make actually on my body. They were just able to do it off of my measurements and just knowing how black people's bodies exist, and it's just everything's better with black folk.
It's nice to have clothes fit you.
Mm-hmm. Just everything's better with black folk. That's the takeaway for today.
No argument. No argument whatsoever.
But yeah, so like that's what I got up to today. And I won't explain exactly what, because some people on the internet might think I'm a horrible person for this. But there was an amount of karma that happened over the last couple of days that I'm a big fan of. Uh, Technically, it's wishing ill on people that are kind of terrible, but it happened, and I'm happy about it, and I'm not gonna pretend that I'm not. Uh,
Ain't nothing wrong with
some
that.
some people that annoy the hell out of me.
Thing.
Yeah, some people that annoy the hell out of me had some bad things happen to them, and you know what? Not gonna pretend it doesn't make me happy.
Nor should you.
Some people might think that makes me a terrible person, and I don't give a damn. But yeah,
Well,
that's what's been going on in my world.
but
Just a lot of shenanigans, really.
if those people think you're that terrible, like what are they going to do? Lock you up and throw away the key?
I mean, maybe at the beginning of a D&D game.
Yeah, I mean that's as far as they're going to get. Not going
I
to be
mean, yeah.
some, dank cell, where light
No.
never reaches.
You're never gonna find me deep under a mountain in some cave.
No, nothing like that. Not
No.
not in some dungeon.
Oh, a dungeon, you say?
Yes, I do.
Get a graphic. Segue!
Right? Yeah.
That's God, if I was better at video production, we would have graphics for this. It was just a segue that rolls by and segue appears on the screen.
That would be delightful. That would be glorious.
But yeah, getting into the actual meat of the episode. Today we're gonna talk about dungeons. We're gonna talk about ways that we as dungeon masters make dungeons, things that you can use to make your dungeons a little more terrifying, and maybe a couple things to make your dungeons less of a slog, because they can get to be that way if you're not careful.
They can. I think the first thing you need to do when you are designing any sort of dungeon is you have to decide what purpose is this filling. What I mean is, are you doing dungeon as a campaign? Like that exists. Waterdeep, Dungeon of the Mad Mage.
Yep.
Like this is a level 5 through 23 level mega dungeon. This is your campaign. It's going to take you months and months to get through all of this.
Mhm.
And if you have players who love nothing more than an endless slog of a dungeon crawl with a big nasty fight at the end, I don't know that I could recommend a better campaign.
Yep.
And
that one's definitely for your players that are more about the fighting than the role playing,
yeah,
for certain.
And it's important to know that. So if you are doing a dungeon as a campaign, that's when your multi-level mega dungeon comes in.
Yeah.
It's just, okay, this is where the whole meat of it takes place. Have a reason for your characters to be there. Have, the story motivation. Maybe it's treasure. Maybe it's to save the world.
It's usually treasure.
It's usually treasure. but whatever it is, make sure you have that. And you can have an entire campaign in one dungeon all by itself. And the nice thing about that, it actually, while designing the dungeons, the levels of it can be difficult, it really cuts down on how much story you have to write.
Oh, yeah.
They're in a dungeon.
Yep.
Doesn't matter what's happening in the kingdom. They're not going to see it again until the end of the campaign.
Nope. It's just, what's happening in the intrigue of the kingdom? Who gives a damn? I'm in a dungeon.
Yep. I'm trying to not get killed by cave ogres. That's what's happening.
And speaking of cave ogres, that brings me to thoughts that I personally have found that people forget when putting creatures in dungeons.
Sure.
Uh, and that's like because everyone wants to throw a gelatinous cube into a dungeon
Please
because
do. Always
gelatinous
do.
cube that takes up the entirety of a hallway is a hilarious encounter.
Yep.
And
Can
also
also
can
be
be
terrifying.
terrifying for low level characters, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but you've got to remember that this dungeon, whatever it is, it's your dungeon.
Yeah.
You can really have, you know, whoever like whatever overseer of the dungeon or whatever, they can fill it with pretty much whatever the hell they want, as long as it makes sense for that creature to work with the big boss of the dungeon or just be living underground.
Yeah. And you can, if you're doing an underground dungeon, which are the most common,
Yep.
you can use the idea of this natural terrain to sort of break up the monotony of what might be in the dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the first few levels, like they go deep, and all of a sudden it goes through a mind flayer colony.
Yep.
It comes out the other side, and that's where the dungeon resumes.
Mm-hmm.
You
Like
can,
you hit this big, just open underground cavern, and that big open underground cavern can be populated with whatever you want, like a mind flayer colony if you're terrifying.
yeah,
Um, or if it's low level, maybe it's a kobold encampment or a kobold city even.
yeah,
Uh,
and you can do that to also break up the monotony of dungeon crawling. If you have some sort of subterranean civilization
Hell,
and
you run into
encampment.
the drow. Better hope you aren't Bjorn.
Exactly. Yeah. Or or you reskin those things to something different.
Yeah.
Me, who will not play Out of the Abyss because I know where you go with that.
Yep.
I've seen one of the chapter names, and I know that's where Drizzt is from. So that's all I need to know.
Yep.
Uh,
That. Yeah.
or you just have a DM who's like, you know what, I'll just cut that section out. Like
Yeah.
that's the cool thing about these. You can alter them as you want.
Absolutely.
Uh, I think with you're saying there about breaking it up some goes into the next kind of dungeons. I think are part of it, and it's just your dungeon crawler campaign
Yep.
where it's not all one dungeon. And Tomb of Annihilation,
Yep.
great example. There are so many different locations you go in this, multiple tombs, multiple dungeons of sorts. Obviously, the big one at the end
Yeah.
is your most significant part, but it's
I,
not the whole campaign.
I don't know.
You
I think the most significant dungeon in that is crawling out from underneath the piles of character sheets from your dead characters going through
yeah,
Tomb of Annihilation.
it's entirely possible that'll happen. But I think
Sometimes you hide behind the pile of dead bards.
you just have to. I think what's great about this one though, it is a dungeon crawling campaign. You do get that wonderful feel. It's got multiple dungeons, but it also you start in Port Ninezaru, which is a vibrant and interesting city. You get to
Yeah.
explore the jungles of Chult, which I think are very cool. So you do get a lot of different tastes in it.
Hmm.
If you have players who don't like dungeons, though, um, just
Yeah.
don't.
And I'll say for campaigns where you know that you have players that don't really like dungeons, that doesn't mean that you can't use dungeons. It just means you need to shrink them.
Yeah,
That's the biggest thing for players that don't like dungeons is usually because they have had a DM that has put them in a dungeon and they were in there for way too long and it was just like, all right, we turn left, we turn right, we turn left. There's a troll, kill it. We turn left. Like,
yeah,
and those dungeons are unfortunately really bad.
yeah. They can feel endless and monotonous, and then particularly once the players end up realizing they were going the wrong way,
Yeah.
that's just very defeating. And I love what you said about shrink it down. I think Curse of Strahd. I think Castle Ravenloft.
Oh yeah.
It is massive. It's certainly not the biggest dungeon out there,
No.
but it's huge. There's so many levels to it,
There's
and I
so
think
much you can get to.
if if you wanted to run a Curse of Strahd campaign, that you could explore every nook and cranny of Castle Ravenloft. To me, as a player, that sounds really cool. I
Yeah.
would love to play in that world. However, if you want to go, hey, in the interest of time, I want to get to the end of this damn campaign before football season starts. If you're me, you set goals like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
or you just go, you know what? Not all my players love dungeons. I'm going to make it that the entire upper part of Ravenloft is inaccessible. They can
Yep.
only access the subterranean floors, and you make it that that's where Strahd has to appear, is
Hmm.
only in those locations. Cuts down on where they can go. There's still a lot of wonderful traps and monsters down there,
Ooh,
but
we gotta talk about traps later.
oh, we will. That is a guarantee. But know what your players are into, and then just decide on your favorite things. And shit, if
Yeah.
there's an aspect that's in like one of the spires of the tower of one of the towers of the castle, and you know you're only going to use the lower floors, you can relocate that to a lower floor.
Yep. Just move it.
You can put shit wherever you want. I've mentioned the dungeon dudes on here a million times. I'm going to
It's because
mention
they're
them
great.
again. They are. And I love a piece of advice they gave on an episode where they were talking about like encounters in a dungeon. Is they said what's great is if your players come to a door, whatever's on the other side of that door doesn't exist until they open the door and you as a DM describe it. It literally doesn't matter what's in your notes. Doesn't matter at all. You can change it whenever. And I'm not saying do this to screw your players over and try and kill them. But if they're totally going down the wrong path of the dungeon and you can see the frustration on their faces, maybe toss them a little W. Hey, here's what you were looking for.
Or toss them a door that is rigged with a fireball spell.
Oh, that's beautiful. You should have those already.
Yeah.
You
Once
or the
once we
doors that
get to once we get to traps, that is
oh,
high on the list.
oh
But a
yeah.
thing that I want to mention when we're talking about like taking dungeons and shrinking them down and repurposing them is that like even in campaigns that you have players that love dungeons, not every dungeon makes sense to be giant and massive.
No.
Like sometimes the dungeon is just a jail cell under a keep, you know, and that's enough room for like what 10 prisoners and then like maybe some maybe a like hidden vault.
Sure. Well, look at Lost Mine of Phandelver, which has multiple dungeons in it. You start with that first goblin cave. It's fairly small. It's
Yep.
got I want to say somewhere between 12 and 15 goblins in it. Few encounters and like a half dozen rooms.
Yeah, and it
That's it.
does all that it needs.
Yeah.
And
It introduces you to a dungeon.
yeah, and you don't need to have everything be a big spiraling dungeon. Is
No.
is my point. Uh, because also as a DM, those are hard. Also, even using like map generators, which I heavily suggest if
Oh
you
man, yeah.
are if you aren't using a pre-written campaign. Like I personally like to play more homebrewed games than pre-written games. That's just my preference as a DM because then
They're fun.
more easily in control of everything I feel. Uh, that's just me. Uh, but using map generators, even the best map generator online still is gonna kind of suck.
Yeah.
So taking those, tweaking them, shrinking them around, is definitely going to be in your benefit. Because a lot of online map generators they generate more mazes than dungeons,
Yes, they do.
and unless you're playing in person and you want to pull out some graph paper and write out a big thing, which sometimes you do, I find it really fun.
Yeah.
I've got a big just grid wet erase big battle mat to use. And I absolutely love drawing out dungeons on that thing. Especially like you just draw it out, put some like papers or a blanket or something on top of it, and just reveal it as they go. Oh, beautiful.
It's not. I couldn't agree. That's delightful. Or if you're using the red erase, if you have a sketch of your own of what it's supposed to look like, you draw it as your players get to different areas. Fill it in.
Personally, I like the reveal more because I am not great at doing straight lines. Um,
Same. No.
not good at doing a lot of things straight. Uh, so I like my things pre-drawn or even if I take the time and ink, I'll just straight up print out a bunch of pieces of paper and like tape them together.
Yeah. Um,
Not exactly that environmentally friendly, I understand, but you know,
we do what we can sometimes.
sometimes you just do stuff because it's convenient and fun, and corporations are really who is hurting us environmentally, not the actual actions of a single person or even a
Fact.
large group of people. But that's a whole other conversation that has nothing to do with dungeons, except maybe putting those heads of corporations in dungeons until they figure their shit out.
I would be fine with that.
Yep.
We could put them in the kind of dungeon that is not, say, a dungeon crawl campaign, but it's sort of it's a multi-session dungeon. It's either part of a larger adventure or it's not quite a one shot, but it's something quick. Yeah. I hold this one up for one big reason is this has the most famous dungeon of them all in it. It has the Tomb of Horrors.
Yep.
Now, I will always give a caveat to Tomb of Horrors. I'll say one, if you have players who are interested in it, man, run it. Just run it. But make sure you only run it for people who are interesting.
Yeah.
Well, they don't know. They don't have to be interesting. They have to be interested in it. They don't need to be interesting. But you can water down some of these dungeons. I think some dungeons have pre-written ones have traps that are just they're a little ridiculous. I
See, I love me some ridiculous traps. Give me
I
some
don't
over the top nonsense traps that are 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 there just to be traps and don't necessarily make sense to be in this kind of dungeon. Give them to me anyway. They're fucking weird and I'm into it.
I don't want all traps to be lethal. If all the traps are lethal, it's boring.
That's
It's
fair.
it's monotonous. Can there be some lethal traps? Sure, but I think you need to go the Tomb of Annihilation route, where by discerning the proper clues, you can figure out that thing's lethal and we should be aware of it.
Hmm.
That's kind of like the only knock I would give against that old Tomb of Horrors is there are some completely lethal traps in there that you just don't know until they goot you, which is
Yep.
why it's made for the right group of people. Um, I think if you're gonna have something like that, if it's a one shot or like, hey, we're only playing these characters for a couple sessions, whatever. Make them as lethal as you want.
Burn it
Have,
all down.
yeah. If it's been a lengthy campaign and you've been playing for 2.5 years, maybe let those characters have a chance of figuring out themselves before you tear up the character sheet that somebody's played for a couple years.
Yeah, maybe. Unless you know that your players don't hold those characters all that precious.
Which is what I was just gonna say. If,
Yeah.
if you know they don't care, then all bets are off.
Anytime I play a game, I have a pile of other characters ready, because my character could die.
Yep.
Could. It'll happen. So I'm ready with my weird ass bard. But yeah, that's I love nonsensical traps. I'm just gonna pull us into talking about traps now
I was just gonna say
because
I
I
think we should.
fucking
'Cause
love traps because a lot of my childhood revolved around as soon when the anime of Pokemon finally came to America.
yeah,
Team Rocket and their pitfall traps, they just hold a special place in my heart. So dungeons, I put so many damn pitfall traps in my dungeons
yes,
because they're wonderful, wonderful low level traps. Especially if you don't put spikes at the bottom of them. If they're
yeah,
just a hole, they're great for low level parties because that fall damage probably isn't going to kill them. Being able to jump over something is probably a thing that they can do without a lot of high level magic. And it can make some fun shenanigans of like, all right, so what do we do? I mean, the halfling can't jump that far, but we do have a half orc that can throw them.
yep. And honestly, my favorite part about the pitfall trap when the fighter or paladin in the heavy plate armor who dumped dexterity
Yep,
falls down there. They've got the hit points. They're fine.
they're fine.
They're fine. But now you have to get their ass out.
And who can lift that? Probably
Exactly.
just them at the bottom of the hole.
Yeah. And I would let it be in the description that, you know what? The walls to this are quite sheer. There's no handholds.
Did
Let
you
them
forget to
figure
get a climber's kit with pittons, pythons?
not
Well,
my problem. Figure it out. No, I'm with you. I love my favorite kinds of traps are the ones where the players have to now deal with what the trap has caused.
hmm
Uh, if we're talking about again, we'll talk about low level characters because that's where we are. I don't think a trap that casts an eighth level fireball that incinerates the entire party as a TPK is interesting. I'm not saying it's not hilarious. I'm saying there's not a potential of it being absolutely God's damned hilarious.
uh, see, with that, just because I've used exactly that before on a low level party, uh, specifically because the rest of the dungeon had like a pitfall trap or two,
Sure.
like a poison dart trap or two, but all of these like scratchings in the wall were saying, "Do not open the door." So many things said, "Do not open the door." It's
You warned
basically
them.
the "don't press the big red button."
You warned them.
And what did they do?
Open
They
the door.
pressed the big red button.
It's fireball,
Please.
wasn't it?
Oh, it was an 8th level fireball.
And that I don't see anything wrong with. Like again, you gave the warnings. I'm saying if it's the very first trap of your dungeon,
Oh yeah, no.
TPKs everyone. It's boring.
Your
Um,
first your first trap in a dungeon should never be lethal.
no,
No
and
matter how funny it is to rig up
a
some
disintegration ray.
or or to rig up if I don't know, your villain is an artificer or just a mechanic, to rig up a giant flail that swings down from the ceiling to smack your players as they step on a pressure plate in front of the door. As hilarious as that is, it should be survivable.
I think a great place to look for results on what traps can do are to get inspirations from say the wild magic table for
Yes.
sorcerers because okay, that one does have the fifth level fireball. So
Yep.
it does have Dorgo Splody. It also has things like turning you into a potted plant.
hmm
I'm sorry, that crap's funny.
Yep.
That crap's
There's there's
funny.
no reason that your traps can't be funny.
Yeah,
I mean,
let
unless you're playing a super serious campaign, and obviously there's a place for those, and we also enjoy them. But sometimes you just need a magical fart noise.
yeah.
And that's
Uh,
really great to do also to low level parties with traps, is just it's a trap that just makes a sound. And
yeah.
yes, it could alert guards, but also it can just be a fun moment of relief when your party's trying to figure out how to get around a trap and then they accidentally trigger it, expecting the worst, and it's just
Exactly. Like it keeps your players on their toes, I think, more when you have a
mm-hmm,
variety of results from the traps. You know,
absolutely.
if it's a party of level 3 adventurers, maybe don't have every tripwire armed with a disintegration ray. It's it's just not that interesting, and it becomes predictable. Your party knows, oh, if we get a tripwire, we might get disintegrated.
Yep.
Okay,
But if it's darts with different poisons on them, like even if it's still just like, oh, it's darts, it's more darts, you don't know what's gonna happen when you get hit with that dart.
no. In
It could
fact,
be,
if you're me, one of those darts gives you the effects of the haste spell.
yep. Oh,
How
so it's just covered in a drug that
cocaine?
we shouldn't mention by name on Twitch.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those things where you could have some traps that actually have positive results because
That's
that'll really
mhm.
mess with your players. Is because now they're going to see every trap and go, "Do I want to?"
Dude. Do I press the big red button?
Yeah, and it's like, well, our barbarian pressed the big red button, 3 traps back. He got a cool new axe. Our cleric pressed the big red button and currently has the head of a goose. The rogue pressed the big red button and lost an arm. So
And it really brings to mind with these different kinds of traps to throw in is you can really use it for storytelling to show the personality of either whoever created the dungeon or who's running it now.
sure,
Because you can have like this big sprawling dungeon that is underneath some mountain that was devised by an eccentric dwarf, but it's now being run by some drow that aren't very eccentric. So you can have a combination of these whimsical traps that are just kind of like, here's some nonsense, and then, oh, you're going to die.
yeah. And I think if you can strike a good balance of humor and terror, you can get your players really invested in every trap they come across. Um, I think it's important in dungeons and when dealing with these traps. Um, it has to be a winnable situation for your players, meaning
Mm-hmm.
it should be possible for them to detect them, and it should be possible for them to disarm them for the most part.
Yeah.
You
It
can
should
have
by
some,
no means be easy.
no, and you can have some that cannot be disarmed. You can have some that's like, nope, this entire room is a trap. And if you lollygag around here and here too long, and your fool ass sets that trap off, you will die. You can make it. No save. It's a lethal trap. But, you know, I think for those, make it clear to your players that this is a room of fuck around and find out.
Yep.
Like, because if you give the clues and maybe they narrowly escape, maybe some of them don't escape, and then it sets into them what clues they saw and then what happened. They'll have that moment of realization. It makes a more interesting story
Yep.
as opposed to them asking after the session, how were we even supposed to know? You don't have to tell them.
The wall.
Yeah,
The
that's it.
carving in the wall.
Don't touch the door.
The big carving in the wall that says, don't touch the door, surrounded by the imprint of a hand covered in soot.
Yep. Like, gave you some clues, y'all. Um, but yeah, I also think as far as like having different types of traps, you mentioned like the pit traps. There's also the standard tripwire trap,
Yep.
door traps, trap treasure chest. I think traps are really interesting when
Mm-hmm.
you kind of design them with your players' character classes in mind, where
Absolutely.
you have certain traps that certain members of the party are better suited to dealing with. And then I think you should have at least one, maybe two, that none of them are suited to deal with.
Yep.
That's what I love to do with a trapped chest.
Yes.
If if none of them have a very high intelligence, I want to have this very clearly Rube Goldbergian trap around it. So they can tell, okay, there's something weird here, and it's clearly trapped. We have no idea how. And none of us are smart enough to figure out how to disarm it. And you just basically get to go, how badly do you want to know what's in that treasure chest?
Who wants to play Mousetrap?
Yep. So, yeah,
Oh,
all this
speaking of
stuff.
Mousetrap,
Yeah.
um, there's, I mean, there have been stories online a myriad of different times, but I have to mention it. Um, as a DM, just use the game Mousetrap as your dungeon. It's
Yeah,
dumb, it's ridiculous, but it is fun.
it
Uh,
is.
Absolutely use Mousetrap as your dungeon. Uh, I just, I just had to mention it at least once today, because if I'd be remiss if we didn't.
Well, but I think you hit on something really key there by saying that is in both dungeons and dealing with traps. If you can hit on cultural touchstones, you really enhance the experience. Example being, if you have a trap that one of your players triggers, and they're in some sort of cave type dungeon. They hear a loud rumbling, and they look about, and all of a sudden they see there is a gigantic
Giant
boulder
boulder.
rolling towards them.
Oh god. Oh, they're gonna be scared and so happy at the same
Exactly.
time.
They're gonna be like, man, it's Raiders of the Lost Ark. We're all Indiana
Hmm.
Jones, and we better run.
Also, if there are stairs in your dungeon, if there's a trap that releases ball bearings on those stairs,
So good. So good.
and then later there's an NPC named Kevin.
Home Alone. Actually, that's a great thing to do as far as thinking of traps. I would say Home Alone, the Saw movies.
Oh
Like,
yeah. If you can incorporate the Saw movies into your traps, yo.
oh, absolutely. Um, in any sort of horror film where there were characters who had time to prepare against whatever menace there was, think
Mhm.
about the kind of traps they designed. Like, and also, like you were saying, figure out who inhabits this dungeon.
Mhm.
I think one of the key things is anytime you have a dungeon, whoever's at the center, I always imagine them having a big sign that just says "Get off my lawn." Like,
Yep. Get
no,
out of my swamp.
yeah, no matter who they are, they don't want these adventurers there.
They don't want to be bothered.
Yeah,
Oh, and
and
like for on that, uh, that also brings to mind with traps and with the whole setup of whatever dungeon that you're making or that you're running. Remember that you want to think about if other people have tried to get through this recently.
yes,
Are there some traps that you see that are set off? Because that's a great way to show your party what could happen without giving them that, like, rocks fall, you die.
I think you touch on something brilliant. Going to the idea of the lethal trap. There's mild damage, there's moderate, there's heavy damage, and then there's just straight up this trap is lethal. And I think if your adventurers are going in a ways, it's Raiders of the Lost Ark again. For example, right the very first temple, Indy puts his hand out into the sunlight, the spiked gate comes out and it
Yep.
impales a skeleton that's clearly been there for some time.
Mm-hmm.
And we now know, okay, if you go into the light, it'll trigger this thing and it will kill you.
And stabity stab.
Yes. And that's a great thing. If your players can see maybe a couple decapitated bodies and
Just, I wonder what happens in this room.
yeah,
Probably won't get a big axe across the neck comeuppance.
exactly. Like
Maybe send the
have those,
halfling through.
yeah, have those things. Have it where your players can look at stuff and go, okay. And you saying that right there with let's send the halfling through. Don't get mad if your players outsmart your trap.
Yeah,
It,
they're
it,
supposed to.
yeah, if they set parameters and you were really hoping you were just going to gooch them with this nasty trap you had built, and they look at it and they realize, oh, all I have to do is this, and by your design, they go around it. Don't be a
Yeah,
doofus and go, I'm gonna make them be on the receiving end of it anyways.
yeah.
Sometimes
Uh,
your players win.
Also, as a player, if you're dealing with traps and you're a relatively new player, one thing I can put into your mind that your character would probably know but you wouldn't, the spell levitate.
Yep.
Just use the spell levitate.
Also, a great item to travel with if you have a place to keep it. If
Is
you don't have a
is it
bag of
an
holding.
immovable rod?
No, it's even more simple. It's just a 10-foot pole.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Poke at it, especially if you're a rogue. If you're a rogue, you know,
Get a collapsible pole, baby.
get a collapsible pole. Just be like, no, you know what? I'm gonna poke that treasure chest from 10 feet away.
Yep. Is it a mimic? We'll find out.
Exactly.
Oh,
Also,
fuck. Mimics.
yes.
Mimics
Um,
don't just have to be treasure chests.
I like doors. Those are my
Oh
favorite.
yeah. You know
Doors.
what's really fun? A mimic is the covering over a pitfall trap.
Yes. Yes. That's good. Get creative with your mimics.
Yep.
They can
I've
be
seen I have seen
awesome.
a mimic bookcase before. That was just mean to the wizard.
If if you have a strength-based fighter or a paladin in the party, and you have a treasure room where there's a gleaming suit of plate armor in the corner, you don't have to make it an animated armor. Make it a mimic.
It's just a mimic.
It's a
That is
mimic.
evil. That
Isn't
is
it
evil,
great?
my good sir.
Yeah.
Because then not only do they not get the armor, but they have a thing to fight.
Yes. No armor,
That's
just a
just
mimic.
mean.
Uh, I love mimics. They are one of my favorite monsters. Um, they're also a monster that I don't really believe you can overuse as long as you always use it cleverly.
Yep.
Um,
As long as it's not always just a treasure chest mimic.
yeah. In
But
fact, the
it would be
mimic
great
could be a
if
piece of treasure inside the treasure chest.
that's that's fucking brilliant, but
Isn't it though?
evil.
Yeah.
My personal favorite things to make mimics are things that your less strengthy people would want to gravitate to,
Oh
like
yes.
like the bookcase, a little mimic book.
Yep.
Maybe for some reason your dungeon is like more abandoned living quarters, and there's a kitchen. Oh, that big old cooking pot.
Mimic.
That's a mimic.
You spoke about the mimic being the covering to a pitfall trap. There is another nasty trap creature I'll mention that I'll go one better for you.
Talking about them droppy boys.
I'm talking about the rug of smothering.
Oh yeah.
Where you have that cover a pitfall trap. Don't even have the pit be that deep. But now the rug of smothering has grabbed a less strengthy character and is smothering them down in this pitfall trap.
Yep.
What do you all want to do? I mean, it's delightful. It's
Look down in the
hilarious.
hole.
Yeah.
Look down in the hole and say, "We'll miss you," and continue on.
Exactly. Well, good run. He didn't have any of the important gear, did he? Because that could
Yeah.
be awkward.
So I also want to bring up, just because I'm looking at the clock and the amount of time we have left.
Yeah.
I do want to mention some more specific mechanics things about building dungeons for your campaigns,
Yes.
as well as placing dungeons in your campaigns. Uh, because as I mentioned earlier, like dungeons don't have to be big. Also, mechanics wise, they often should not be that big. I mean, even if it's a jailbreak, even if it's a, you know, the characters were poisoned in the night and wake up here, something, your dungeons don't need to be this big, huge, sprawling thing.
No,
And it
never.
wouldn't make sense most times for them to be this big, huge, sprawling thing.
Right.
Uh, and so you want to keep, personally, I like to keep my dungeons to like, I think about dungeons in sections.
Mhm.
And so, like, if it's a big dungeon, it's going to have like 3, 4, 5 sections. If it's a
Right.
small dungeon, it's going to have just like one or two. And I like to keep it to 4, 5 rooms max a
Yes.
section. That is like, personally, that's just me. Uh, but whether it's a maze or whether it's just kind of this area, I like to keep it 4, maybe 5 rooms before you head into the next one, or before you have some kind of change of how this dungeon is, or you have a
Agreed.
feeling of going down a floor or something like that.
And I think it's important, especially when you're talking about those smaller ones. Like I think if you're having a small dungeon and maybe it is only 5 rooms, we'll talk about your classic jailbreak kind of thing. When you have your enemies spaced out in it, think about the kind of enemies that should inhabit this space. Don't have anything there overly absurd, but in the event of, say, the jailbreak, you can go, okay, well, I have a bunch of human guards here. If you want to make it interesting, maybe one of the prisoners is something like this massive ogre that
Mm-hmm.
when you broke in, they happen to be changing it from one cell to another. And depending on what happens, that thing might get loose and it
Or he
might not
might let it
care.
loose on purpose.
Yeah. And also, though, it might not care who's between its path and freedom. It might bust your ass up getting through. So, though that is kind of a monster and a trap also combined.
Mm-hmm. Like, especially if you're using a dungeon that is designed for, the housing of prisoners or just locking things away to never be seen again. There's also the fun you can play with of, do we let this thing out or not?
Yeah.
And if it's a dragonborn, do not let them
Let them
out.
out. I'm going to let them out because we appreciate our Dragonborn. We love them.
Nope. Do
Love
not
them
let
all.
them out, because that
Yeah.
dragonborn will turn around and try to murder your party, starting with the druid.
They might not. You don't know. Hashtag not all Dragonborn.
Hashtag bandit was right. It's the one
um,
thing I will hold on to for our entire almost 3-year campaign was that I said, Bandit said, I mean, we could help this guy out, or we could just leave. And I was right. We should have just left.
left his ass there. Um, yeah, I enjoy a good dungeon. I think most players do. Now, what I want to ask to you though is, do you think usually like dungeons are a place where characters should want to try and be stealthy?
uh, I feel like when you're like as a DM when you're making dungeons, your players are going to want to stealth anyway,
Sure.
regardless of if you make it seem like they should or not.
Right.
So you can easily design an entire dungeon that's just like, hey, stealth is going to be tough. And even if it looks like stealth is going to be really difficult, your players are going to try it anyway, because
You're not wrong.
there are very few times that players are predictable. That's one.
Stealth is very, yeah. I I think a good thing to do with some of your encounters, um, have it where there's at least one or two instances that if they fail in stealth, it's not just that they alert what's nearby and now there's an encounter. Make it that it draws what would have been a second encounter in as well. Now,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, don't do this if both encounters would have been deadly. That's
Yeah.
like I don't
Well, and
believe.
also, if you end up doing that in the first encounter, then the second encounter probably doesn't exist because you had it at the same time as the first.
Yes, yeah. I'll always say I don't think a guaranteed TPK is ever interesting. Uh, I think the potential of one is what's
Yeah.
interesting. That's why I would say I wouldn't want two deadly encounters to possibly both happen because of a botched stealth roll. But if it
Yeah.
was a medium encounter and maybe a hard encounter and combined, that made it a deadly encounter. That to me is actually
Yeah.
interesting. Where we botched stealth and now we're fighting for our lives
Mhm.
and we really
And
have to think what we're doing on our turns.
and in your
That's
dungeons, and in your dungeons with stealth that you know your players are going to do
oh
because it's a dungeon, we're going to try and sneak through it. Uh give them a chance to hide a second time.
yeah,
Like, give them a chance with a perception check to hear that someone heard them fuck up. And now they have to hide harder and more specifically.
yes,
Uh, because also,
it'll be
telling your
hilarious.
players that can make them make very, very rash decisions. Like a particular encounter that I ran doing Icewind Dale. There's an encounter where there is a sleeping enemy, and you need to break some NPCs out of a prison cell. And there are ways to make that old rusty prison cell quiet. And if you keep it quiet, you don't have to worry about that sleeping enemy. Uh, but the enemy hears something once, get up, and it's a relatively large enemy, so you hear it move. But if their perception check's high enough, they can tell it's not necessarily moving in their direction.
Sure.
It's just awake now. And that can bring up some heightened dread. It can also make your players make dumb decisions like, oh, it's awake and it knows we're here, so let's just throw acid on the bars and run.
Which to me ends up being more interesting than it's awake and it's attacking you now.
Yeah.
If you again, especially like you said, if you have guards or the inhabitant of whatever wake up, make them an additional threat or challenge. I would use Metal Gear Solid as an example here. When someone hears Solid Snake, they hear a sound, and now they're out and exploring. That exploring guard is now an additional challenge. They haven't spotted you yet,
Yeah.
so it's not, full exclamation point alert, but they know you're out there.
It's question mark alert.
Exactly. Which is it's a little nerve wracking and it's wonderful. And it also it can make you make dumb mistakes when you're playing that game.
It sure can.
Gotta hide.
Quick, gotta hide. Let's duck into this room. We don't know what's in that room. Quick! Oh,
Yep.
God. It's
Into
the
the room.
barracks.
Yes. Yeah. You go in there, you're like, uh-oh.
Oh, hello, boys. Were you sleeping in here?
You're running around in this cave. You know that the ogre is now awake and lumbering somewhere. You're like, quick. Well, we'll hide in this cavern. Well, it's really dark in there. We don't know what's in there. You hide in there. Someone just lights up a torch just enough, and there's a sleeping dragon there. And it's going, oh,
Meep.
yep.
That's the Wile E. Coyote. Yikes.
Yeah.
Yeah, setting those moments up can be really great. And that's something we didn't mention earlier, but we should have, is having a larger threat than your party is actually supposed to take on in the dungeon can be fucking magnificent.
Yes.
Where where like the party can even know about it. Be like,
yeah.
all right, we're going in through here to take out the bandit camp that has taken up residence in these caves. We also know the bandit camp does not go more than 2 floors down, because if they go further down than that, there's a fucking aboleth.
Yep. Yeah. Have the threat that your party can't deal with. Have those creatures where it's like, oh, if this thing decides it wants a piece of you, you're going to die.
Yep.
Like, have that. Don't be afraid to have a dungeon where maybe there's a young blue dragon in it, and your players are all level 3, and there is no way they could withstand that. Make sure they have clues if they're getting near the blue dragon or it's getting near them.
Scorch marks on the wall, the
Yep.
smell of ozone in the air.
Exactly. And that's where it simply is just no, you have to run. There are great video games with unkillable enemies.
Mhm.
All you can do is run from them, and you have to do your best to slow them down.
Absolutely.
I think of terrifying things like, well, this one isn't unkillable, but it felt damn near the big daddies in BioShock.
Like the first time you
start,
encounter them,
they're basically unkillable. If you're really good at the game, you technically can keep moving around, dodge a move. But aside from being, all thumbs and reactions, if those things decide they want a piece of you, you're done. You are
on a drill.
And if you hear their, moan and you start hearing those footprints, yeah, you lock up. You're like, where is it?
Meep. Yeah.
Those
And adding in those things for ambiance also when your players are going through a dungeon. Perception checks galore. You hear dripping.
It's wonderful. And if you're to play a fairly lengthy campaign, maybe have something in there that they have no business fighting, they legit can't handle. Make sure it gets to see them before they leave.
so that it remembers them.
Yep. And make sure that they know that it saw them. You'll have a memorable encounter down the line.
Yeah. And that's one of the great things about dungeons in D&D is that they're really multi-purpose.
Yes.
The only thing that sucks about the prevalence of dungeons in Dungeons and Dragons, because it is Dungeons and Dragons, is that there are a lot of character classes that, like, and this is more for past editions because they've kind of gotten rid of it in 5th, but like in 3.5 and in Pathfinder and in like D20 Modern, D20 Fantasy, and even D20 Future, which those it's an amazing set of books. I heavily recommend them if you're like, I'm tired of playing D&D, but I still kind of want to play D&D. D20 Fantasy, Modern, and Future are beautiful because it's basically the same system, but the writers put their own tweaks on it, as well as Modern, as the name suggests, is current day as of, like, I think current day for that was, like, the late 90s.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, and, like, D20, D20 Future is, like, you're in space.
Exactly.
You're in a mech anime in space. But there are all these beautiful and wonderful character classes that have animal companions and mounts and flying. And you know what can't do well in a cave?
Those.
A triceratops that your cavalier is riding.
Exactly. Like not gonna do so hot.
And that's the biggest knock to dungeons that I can think of, besides just people that don't know how to design dungeons very well and make them
Right.
just a long, giant, boring maze, is that if you've got a tall, big, or taller, or bigger character, or you've got your druid whose favorite transformation is something big, or a wizard that loves to polymorph into a T-Rex, maybe don't do your dungeon.
Yeah.
Or specifically do your dungeon to make them think of other tactics.
Exactly.
There's the double edge on that.
There is, and if your campaign is going to have a lot of dungeons, I think it's good to let your players know that up front, because it could very much really influence and inspire what they choose and what they build.
Mm-hmm.
I know the kind of characters I would play, if only if we're talking like pre-written, just as an example. If someone said, "Hey, we're doing Dungeon of the Mad Mage," there are characters I would run for that I wouldn't use for other ones, like Waterdeep Dragon Heist, because of how social that one is.
Yep.
So make sure that everyone's going to have fun, because the dungeons should be fun. They're
Yep.
a huge part of the game, and have fun with those traps.
And also, just because it is in the name of the game, put a dragon in your dungeon.
Even if it's just a dragon figurine.
Yep. Oh, that's glorious. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah,
that is hilarious.
Have some sort of dragon in there. Doesn't have to have a stat block.
I'm just now imagining a big like campaign dungeon where it's like, hey, you need to get to the bottom of this dungeon and slay the dragon. And like everyone knows about it. Adventurers come from far and wide and can't deal with this dungeon. Your party finally makes it all the way down to the bottom, and it's just a dragon figurine.
Yep. That's it.
With like a magical light behind it that shines a big shadow.
Yeah.
it's just the dungeon of the shadow puppet.
Yeah. I would even encourage in your very first dungeon in a campaign, have something even with like a dragon motif on it. Like maybe your players find a dagger, but the hilt has these ornate dragons engraved into it. So it's like, there you go, you got dragons.
Here we go. You're in a dungeon, and there's a dragon.
So there you go. And then you make that item mean something down the line, but you won't know.
Yep. It'll be, some important family heirloom from some ridiculous monarch that you all kind of hate.
Yep.
And kind of hates you until it sees that dagger on your hip.
Exactly.
And then,
And remember, use those mimics. Mimics, mimics, mimics.
yep,
Mimics.
always mimics.
Yeah.
Uh,
Your players will hate it when the mimic shows up because
Absolutely.
the reaction's always the same, and that's it's a mimic.
It's you son of a bitch. I'm in. Uh, and by I'm in, I mean I've been grappled by it, didn't make the check, and I'm now sucked into its mouth.
Yep, yep. And now the mimic is chewing on you.
Which, that is a wonderful place to end this episode. Because we are at time.
Yeah. Started talking about the D, and now we're talking about getting sucked into the mouth.
That's wonderful and awful.
Yeah. Talking about dungeons and mimics, because those phrases mean the D is a dungeon, getting sucked in the mouth. We're talking about a mimic.
It's not. That's.
No?
Yep, that's 100% what it is. That's what it means. No one tell him. So, thank you so much for being around for this episode. Please remember to do all the internet things. And we'll see if YouTube wants to stop keeping our videos in pending hell.
Right.
Because maybe some of you noticed that the episode from last week didn't go up until today, and that's because it was just pending forever. Because I looked and I was like, I remembered to put it up, because I'm trying to be good at that. But nope, it was just pending forever.
Get on it. Just figure it out.
I mean, sometimes it happens. It's a well-known glitch that just happens. So we'll see if it picks up. But if not, well, they'll be up there eventually. Regardless, thank you. Please do all the internet things. And Bjorn, what do we always say?
Do something nice for yourself this weekend.